Hey everybody. Sorry I'm late. I just got finished eating dinner and whatnot, but I am here. I am here. I am here. Paul Greene-Dennis here, aka Deep Green VO. And I am here to finish up chapter 6 of One Nation Under Blackmail by Whitney Webb, called A Private CIA. The last section of this chapter dealing with a private CIA, but this last part dealing with the origins of the Iran deal, the infamous Iran deal. And with that, and I'm also, because this last section of the chapter is rather short, I'm gonna jump into the next chapter 7 and like the first few portion of chapter 7 as well. So with that, let's get this show on the road. Chapter 6, the last part of Chapter 6 of Private CIA, the last section, Origins of the Iran Deal. Bill Casey's appointment as Director of Central Intelligence was hardly popular with many on the Hill and the broader political establishment. One particularly vehement opponent was Barry Goldwater, whom Casey had sparred with back in the 1960s. Casey had designated Goldwater as a candidate of an increasingly incoherent right-wing fringe, and Goldwater clearly held a grudge against the veteran spook. He proposed his own candidate, Bobby Ray Inman, the Naval Intelligence and NSA chief who had done much to disrupt the Shackley clique by shuttering Task Force 157. Hold on. Goldwater even went so far as to personally lobby Reagan to appoint Inman rather than Casey. But he was only successful in getting Inman the number 2 position at the agency. The split at the top of the intelligence hierarchy was part of a cascade of factional struggles that swept across Reagan's first term as president. Joseph Persico has described how quickly the CIA bureaucracy was polarized between the two men, eventually reaching a point where Casey's staff and Inman's staff barely communicated. Inman was blocked from participating in major operations, such as the early Contra Support operations. And Casey even went so far as to plant stories about Inman in the press. Casey devised a new division of labor in the agency so that it gave him unfettered access to President Reagan, a privilege that Inman did not enjoy. Joseph Trento argues, drawing on sources from within the intelligence community, that the rivalry between the two men was capitalized on by Casey's other rival, then Vice President George H.W. Bush. Inman, already close to Bush, acted as his eyes and ears within the CIA. Bush was a walking tightrope, Trento writes. Inman considered himself a friend of Bush's and was reporting to Bush on Casey's activities within the CIA. At the same time, Inman's great rival, Shackley, was also reporting to Bush. To make matters more complicated, Shackley and his core group of associates, Richard Secord and Thomas Clines, among others, were increasingly active in Casey's off-the-books operations, apparently walking a tightrope of their own between other rival factions. Details scattered throughout Persico's biography of Casey add credence to Trento's claims. When Inman accepted the CIA job, for example, he wanted Bush present for the welcoming ceremony. "George Bush isn't welcome out here," Casey told him, alluding to the CIA. Inman waited for an explanation, but none was forthcoming. At another point, Casey flew into a rage on discovering that Inman had been frequently meeting with Bush and briefing him on intelligence matters. Inman stepped down from his CIA post in 1981 and turned toward a career in the private sector. The presence of Bush's influence can be seen in some of his subsequent business affairs. Inman, in the mid-1980s, worked as the head of an electronics industry holding company called Westmark, which in turn owned Tracor, a major defense contractor that produced electronics for weapons systems. The main group behind Tracor was a web of in-laws and business associates of Walter Mischer, the same Texas banker and real estate developer that Pete Bruton had found to have been involved with Bush in private intelligence operations. There are other indications that Bush was operating his own intelligence web within the Reagan administration. Seymour Hersh, for example, charged that Bush, wary of Casey, set up a team of military operatives that bypassed the national security establishment, including the CIA, and wasn't answerable to congressional oversight. According to Hersh, this team included Vice Admiral Arthur Moreau, then serving as assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Daniel Murphy, Bush's Chief of Staff, and Donald Gregg, the former CIA officer who had become Bush's advisor on national security. Gregg, as discussed earlier, had a history with Shackley and may have been involved in the October surprise. According to Joseph Trento, Gregg served as a channel of communication between Bush and Shackley. Such was the reality of the Reagan administration. Despite the outward appearance of strength and unity, the internal dynamics were characterized by rivalry, factionalism, double-dealing, and, on occasion, moments of fragile cooperation. This was the heady environment that incubated the Iran-Contra affair, in which the U.S. government violated several of its own laws in an attempt to covertly finance the Nicaraguan Contras in their fight against the country's Sandinista government. It was very much the legacy of the Shackley-Wilson private intelligence network. Though Ed Wilson was, by this point, in prison for his Libyan escapades, old veterans of that network such as Clines, Secord, and even Gray were active in this new covert war. Wow. Oliver North, Secord's primary partner in orchestrating many of the Byzantine plots that characterized the Contra support efforts, appears to have been operating on behalf of Casey, who had been blocked from overtly supporting the Nicaraguan rebels by Congress. For example, Casey directly intervened to keep North in the National Security Council when he was supposed to be rotated back to regular Marine duties. The close proximity of North to Casey adds credence to the allegations made by Seymour Hersh that Bush's own intelligence operations had leaked details to the press concerning North and Secord's arms sales to Iran. Shackley himself was called to testify in the wake of the revelations of the scandal. He was never found to be connected with the affair, though subsequent statements by investigators suggest that, behind closed doors, there was doubt as to his professed innocence. The facts that he shared during his testimony were, however, quite revealing. In the course of his work for John Deuce, Shackley deployed the services of a former Savak agent named Navzar Razmara as a source of information on Middle East oil and the geopolitical situation surrounding the Iran-Iraq war. Through Razmara, Shackley was plugged into a network of former Iranian military officers who maintained some contact with the country's post-revolution government. In November 1984, as the hostage crisis in Lebanon was mobilizing the National Security Council, Shackley traveled to Hamburg, Germany, with Razmara to meet with the former Savak general Manouchehr Hashemi, no relation to Cyrus and Jamshid Hashemi. The ostensible goal of this meeting was to introduce Shackley and Razmara to interesting Iranians who were traveling in Europe at the time and from Iran. Present for the meeting was Manouchehr Ghorbanifar, an arms dealer and shady businessman with ties to both the older pro-Shah military officers and the new intelligence apparatus of Khomeini's government. There were numerous meetings over the course of that day, and many of the details about them are redacted in the publicly available version of Shackley's deposition. What is revealed is that Ghorbanifar approached Shackley with questions concerning the acquisition of TOW missiles, anti-tank guided missiles that the Iranians were seeking in hopes of turning the tide with their conflict with Iraq. Shackley claims that he rejected Ghorbaniffar's overtures, yet TOW missiles were not the only thing on the arms dealer's mind. Ghorbanifar stated that for a price, he could arrange for the release of the U.S. hostages in Lebanon through his Iranian contacts. Shackley's version of these events is somewhat difficult to believe. The TOW missiles that would be shipped in Iran were not to be used as a source of financing for the Contras, but were to guarantee that Iran would utilize its influence to release the hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. One of these hostages was, in fact, a CIA station head whom Shackley had been close to. These weapon sales were carried out by individuals all closely associated with Shackley, working in concert with Ghorbanifar. Yet somehow we are supposed to believe that Shackley's 1984 meeting in Hamburg had happened just by chance. Also suspicious was that Shackley had written a memo on his meeting with Ghorbanifar and dispatched it to Lieutenant General Vernon Walters at the State Department. This memo was brought up during Robert McFarlane's deposition. Little role play here. You recall that Ted Shackley, back in 1984, sent a memo to Vernon Walters suggesting we have a new relationship with Iran. Were you aware of that? No, sir. That recommendation that was discarded and that the memo was retyped in June of 1985. Actually, June 7th of 1985, it was sort of retyped and given to Michael Eden. Are you aware of that? No, sir. That Michael Eden gave it to Oliver North? I didn't know that. Are you aware of a John Shaheen? The name is familiar. I believe he was associated with Mr. Khashoggi. Actually, he was a very close friend of Bill Casey's. They served together in World War II in the OSS, and John Shaheen floated a possible hostage initiative on behalf of Cyrus Hashemi. That proposal was determined by the State Department to be unworthy of pursuit. Were you aware that was being done at the same time we had paper being prepared by a recommendation by John Shaheen? No, sir, I don't. Were you aware that the State Department looked behind the Shaheen proposal and saw Mr. Ghorbanifar? Cyrus Hashemi, John Shaheen's contact, who put the October surprise conspiracy in motion, was indeed a close associate and business partner of Manasseh Ghorbanifar, and the two would operate in the murky world of arms trafficking up until Ghorbanifar broke ties with him and partnered instead with Adnan Khashoggi. According to Gordon Thomas and Matt Dillon, Ghorbanifar and Robert Maxwell were well acquainted, having been introduced to each other by Cyrus Hashemi. Subsequently, both Khashoggi and Ghorbanifar were recruited by Israel to help traffic arms to Iran to bolster the country in its fight against Iraq, allowing the two enemies of the Jewish state to continue to weaken each other. Overseeing this operation was David Kimche, a former Mossad officer and at the time general of Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Robert Maxwell, who was playing a supporting role in the plan, was also actively working on behalf of Israel intelligence. As will be detailed in Chapter 9, Khashoggi and Ghorbanifar were also connected, as well as Maxwell, to the Promise Scandal, also known as the Inslaw Affair. Shackley might have been privy to these complicated arrangements and designed his testimony concerning the 1984 Hamburg meeting to suppress the knowledge of his role in them. In his memo, he had effectively ordered Ghorbanifar services to the State Department. Former CIA officer William Corson holds that he did this because Israeli intelligence suggested it. Israel is everywhere in this. This sort of interplay between Shackley's network and other factions detailed in this chapter with Israeli intelligence would be a recurring theme throughout the Reagan era and beyond. You don't say about that last part, and beyond. And with that, that's the end of Chapter 6 of Private CIA. However, I am going to go on for a minute because I want to do the first portion of Chapter 7, A Killer Enterprise. How about that? Because I won't be here Friday and all of next week. So I want to at least get this in the first portion of Chapter 7. So, Chapter 7, A Killer Enterprise. First portion, Outlaw Banks. We must learn to feel that BCCI is this power. Read a bizarre memo once circulated by the Bank of Commerce and Credit International, better known as BCCI. That power was a reference to the image printed in light tones behind the text, a print of Michelangelo's famous creation of Adam, the fresco painting that adorns the creation of the Sistine Chapel. It shows God surrounded by angels and with his finger outstretched, reaching toward the first man, Adam, imbuing him with the gift of life. In continuing the reference of Michelangelo's depiction of the divine spark, the memo stated that BCCI is not merely a group of branches, a set of facts and figures. Since BCCI is a power, a spirit, a desire, it is all encompassing and unfolding. It relates itself to cosmic power and wisdom, which is the will of God. Wow. Sounds like you're about to buy into a cult of personality. Oh yeah, sorry, extra time. Founded in 1972, BCCI certainly wielded considerable power in its day, though its power was hardly of a spiritual or benevolent variety. When it finally collapsed after a nearly 2 decades run, thanks to forced closures brought about by regulators and law enforcement, so too did the planetary Ponzi scheme it had been running. At the time of its collapse in 1991, Time ran a lengthy story describing the bank as the dirtiest bank of them all. The authors of that article, Jonathan Beatty and S.C. Gwynn, also wrote that Robert Morgenthau, Manhattan's district attorney, had stated that he received no help from the Justice Department when he launched his own investigation into the bank. Obfuscation and protection from the highest levels of power were defining characteristics of BCCI. The bank's founder, Aga Hassan Abedi, who had a penchant for occult ramblings and mind games, surrounded himself with a bevy of politicians, community leaders, business giants, powerful criminals, and spooks. Prior to the formation of BCCI, Abedi, a Pakistani banker, had been an economic advisor to Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan. Sheikh Zayed had been the driving force behind the formation of the United Arab Emirates and was the union's first leader. According to one person close to Abedi, he had been the one who had first planted the idea of what would become the UAE in Sheikh Zayed's mind. Abedi was something of a cosmopolitan, an internationalist, and an opponent of classical colonialism in the developing world. At the same time, he opposed socialist currents sweeping across the Middle East and elsewhere. A self-described liberal, he first conceived of BCCI as a world bank, a global bank for the third world. With backing from Sheikh Zayed, the Saudi royal family, and probably the Saudi intelligence service, what developed was something else entirely. BCCI's expertise was in money laundering, capital flight, fraud, and much, much worse. While the conventional narrative presents BCCI as an enterprise whose origins lay in Pakistani Saudi networks of power, influence, and finance, there have also been allegations that the bank's origins also involved the CIA. A 1992 report published in Newsweek cites an anonymous former officer of BCCI and its predecessor, United Bank, as well as the close associates of Abedi's, who asserted that Abedi had worked with the CIA during his United Bank days and that the CIA had encouraged him in this project to launch BCCI, since the agency realized that an international bank could provide valuable cover for intelligence operations. This same source specifically mentioned Richard Helms, CIA director from 1966 until 1973, as having been involved in the bank's creation. He told Newsweek, "What I have been told is that it wasn't a Pakistani bank at all. The guys behind the bank weren't Pakistani at all. The whole thing was a front." According to Beatty and Gwynn, the bank's organizational structure was divided between two very different worlds. On the front-facing side, more conventional departments of BCCI handled such services as laundering money for the drug trade and helping dictators loot their national treasures. On the back end, meanwhile, was something that was called the Black Network, which reportedly continued after the demise of the bank. This Black Network operates a lucrative arms trade business and transports drugs and gold, engages in sex trafficking, and maybe even murder for hire. In some cases, it even helps shape the military capacities of entire nations. Damn. Thus, BCCI supported the work of A.Q. Khan, a Pakistani nuclear physicist and engineer known as the father of Pakistan's nuclear weapons program. This work had begun after India tested the Smiling Buddha, their own nuclear weapon, in 1974, and it was carried out under the auspices of Khan Research Laboratories. The clandestine laboratory operated several front groups, one of which was the Ghulam-e-Ishaq Khan Institute of Engineering Sciences and Technology, a philanthropic arm of BCCI. The BCCI Foundation provided funding for this institute. According to Beatty and Gwynn, BCCI obtained, on behalf of Pakistan and Iraq, an experimental weapon called a Columbine head. Columbine heads were allegedly a type of thermobaric bomb, better known as a fuel-air explosive, as they suck in the surrounding air to create a powerful explosion. It was not all bombs, however, when it came to BCCI's activities in Abedi's home country. The bank also played an important role in tightening relations between Pakistan and states in the Persian Gulf. The economic development of Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi had been built on the massive flow of cheap labor from Pakistan. There was a reciprocal flow of money from those states back to Pakistan through migrant remittances, that is, money sent by laborers to their families at home. In the developing world, remittances are often a complicated issue, with the lack of strong banking sectors and financial regulators resulting in everything from overcharging for financial transactions to outright theft. BCCI stepped into this world and soon made itself the primary conduit for the flow of such money. It was a win-win for all parties. The functioning of this system solidified the use of Pakistani labor by states in the Persian Gulf, while Pakistan received inflows of foreign currencies. It was good for BCCI too. The remittance float was registered on BCCI's balance sheets, allowing the bank to appear far more cash-rich than it really was. Other services that BCCI provided for the Arab ruling families included the procurement of Pakistani prostitutes, typically teenage girls, known as singing and dancing girls. When discussing these types of activities, the congressional report on BCCI came close to revealing the bank-black network dichotomy discussed by Beatty and Greene in Time. The head of BCCI's Pakistan operations was a close friend of Abedi named Sani Ahmad. Nazir Chinoy, BCCI's general manager for France and Africa, told investigators that Sani was the trusted man for things no one else was supposed to know. We were the technocrats. Sani Ahmed would handle the things we wouldn't, like get girls. If anyone paid anyone any money as a bribe, Sani would have been the one to do it. BCCI's role in sex trafficking, including minors, is discussed in Chapter 11. Yo, this sex trafficking, Early on, BCCI saw a pipeline into the U.S. financial system as being necessary to its success. The earliest attempts to cement this connection saw Abedi court American Express. This plan was abandoned when American Express demanded significant influence over BCCI's internal activities. Abedi then pivoted toward Bank of America, one of the largest American banks that, since the 1960s, had been active in the euro-dollar trade. Wow. Bank of America became a large stakeholder in BCCI, holding some 30% of the stock, and a number of the bank's officials joined the BCCI board. Bank of America later sold that 30%, expressing concern over BCCI's activities. It looked like Bank of America was engaging in due diligence, but appearances were deceiving. As a congressional BCCI report pointed out, Bank of America would in fact retain correspondent banking relations with BCCI, continually seek additional business from BCCI, collude in at least one of BCCI's purchase of foreign banks through nominees in South America, and earn a great deal of money from the relationship until BCCI's closure. Oh my God. Color me not surprised. Ultimately, Bank of America's sale of the shares simply allowed BCCI to further develop its complicated web of front companies, proxies, and offshore entities that it used to mask its activities. The bank turned to ICIC, Overseas Limited, set up in the Caymans by BCCI, to act as a clearing house to sell shares of BCCI subsidiaries. Beyond their relationship with Bank of America, BCCI's major penetration of the U.S. financial system came through the bank's involvement with Burt Lance, a prominent banker from Atlanta and a close friend of Jimmy Carter. He served as an advisor to Carter's 1976 presidential campaign and was subsequently named director of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. However, Lance was soon forced from his post under the cloud of scandal. In the words of the Congressional BCCI report, by September 21st, 1977, when Burt Lance tendered his resignation from the position of director of the OMB to President Jimmy Carter, Lance had become the most notorious banker in the United States. Lance's notoriety was directly related to the National Bank of Georgia, of which Lance had become president in 1975. His time there was marred by controversy. For instance, he had particularly tense relations with the bank's parent company, Financial General Bankshares, FGB, for making loans which both exceeded his lending limit and were not secured by collateral. These activities, as well as similar ones that Lance had carried out at other banks, haunted him during his time at the OMB, particularly when Carter asked Congress to suspend ethics rules that would have forced Lance to sell 190,000 shares of stock he owned in National Bank of Georgia. He based his request on the ground that Lance would lose $1.6 million if he was forced to sell, because the bank's stock was depressed. His request instead resulted in a sweeping investigation into Lance's banking practices. Lance was also violating regulations by engaging in other financial activities while serving in public office. FGB's major stockholder and controller, General George Olmsted, was under orders from the Federal Reserve to unload his stock due to laws governing holding companies. He approached Lance for help, and Lance began to hunt for buyers for their holdings in FGB and National Bank of Georgia. Olmsted is an intriguing figure, and his history in banking might shed some light on why FGB was such a hot commodity in the 1970s. During World War II, Olmsted wore many hats, with involvement in everything from managing lend-lease arrangements to working in intelligence in the China-Burma-India theater. After the war, he took control of International Bank in Washington, D.C., and built a business empire with extensive holdings in other banks, real estate, and insurance companies. It was through International Bank that he bought his controlling stake in FGB. Another major international bank holding was the Cayman Islands-based Mercantile Bank and Trust. Mercantile was one of the many banks that composed Paul Helliwell's dark money network, and it owned a stake in his Castle Bank and Trust. During his last days as director of OMB, Lance put Olmsted in touch with J. Middendorf, who had served as Secretary of the Navy and as ambassador to the Netherlands under President Nixon. Middendorf was also close to Carter, who had offered to retain him as Navy Secretary. Middendorf opted instead for a career in the private sector. He was immediately intrigued by Lance's plan, and the Middendorf Group was put together to take over FGB. The Middendorf Group consisted of prominent business figures like Jackson Stevens, the Arkansas kingmaker behind Stevens Inc., their banker George Pereira, and Armand Hammer of Occidental Petroleum. Stevens, discussed in greater detail in the next chapter, was particularly important to the whole chain of events involving FGB and its takeover by BCCI. He had known Lance since at least 1975, likely through their mutual support for Jimmy Carter, whom Stevens had allegedly known since their days at the Naval Academy. Stevens and Lance continued to work together on selling off FGB even after the Middendorf Group fell apart. Reportedly, Stevens was involved in the bank's convoluted affairs because He wanted FGB to use a company he controlled, Systematics Incorporated, for its data processing business. Other prospective buyers had different motives. Armand Hammer, for example, saw a gold mine of valuable information that could be leveraged for political and economic gain. FGB had outstanding loans to more than 100 U.S. senators and congressmen. Hammer explained that all these congressional borrowers had submitted statements to the bank that revealed their precise financial status, including their debts, earnings, real estate holdings, other assets. Hammer had blackmail in mind. As will be mentioned in Chapter 9, Hammer's father had been a spy for Soviet intelligence, and suspicious that he too had a relationship with the security intelligence apparatus of the USSR, dogged Armand Hammer for years. This makes his interest in using FGB for the financial blackmail of American senators and congressmen particularly significant. However, Hammer eventually abandoned his takeover scheme and sold off his shares to BCCI frontmen. It is possible that his encounter with the bank was not a one-off event, however, as throughout the 1970s, roughly 1 million shares in Hammer's Occidental Petroleum were held by one of BCCI's agents, Gaith Farron. In the New York Times blurb on the arrangement, Farron was described as Occidental's representative in Saudi Arabia. Later, Occidental partnered with the London-based Attic Oil Company Limited, which was led by a handful of BCCI players. These included Farron and Kamal Adham, the former Saudi intelligence chief and co-founder of the Safari Club. BCCI came to be involved with FGB only after the Middendorf Group had begun to split apart. The primary agents in the BCCI takeover of FGB were Lance, Stevens, and Eugene Metzger, a Washington attorney who had formerly served in the Justice Department and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. It appears that BCCI was first interested in the FGB subsidiary, National Bank of Georgia. During a meeting with a BCCI representative in Little Rock, Arkansas, Stevens and Lance suggested that they purchase FGB. Shortly thereafter, the pair, joined by Metzger, began to accumulate large holdings of FGB stock, purchased on both the open market and from individual shareholders. These shares were then sold to investors operating on behalf of BCCI, including Kamal Adham. By January 1978, BCCI had secretly gained control of 20% of FGB. Facing a hostile takeover, the bank's leadership hit back with a lawsuit aimed at Abedi, Lance, Metzger, Stevens, and Stevens' company, Stevens Incorporated in Systematics. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission launched its own suit, charging securities fraud. To defend itself against this legal onslaught, the Lance Group retained the services of Clark Clifford and Robert Altman. According to Clifford and Altman, this was their first interaction with BCCI. Their timeline may not have been entirely truthful. However, considering the contents of a Washington Post article from December 1977. In the article, Altman is quoted as saying that Lance was involved with Middle Eastern financial interests and has set up for them a holding company to direct their capital into banks and other U.S. investments. The SEC suit was settled quickly, but the challenge posed by FGB tossed roadblock after roadblock in BCCI's path. The battle dragged on for a year before a Maryland judge ruled in favor of FGB, stating that the bank could not be acquired by a hostile takeover. BCCI was blocked, but not defeated. Clifford selected 3 of his close associates to act as hidden proxies for BCCI's interest and managed to get them onto the board of FGB. One of these individuals, former Senator Stuart Symington, was also made the chairman of a company registered in the Netherlands affiliates called Credit and Commerce American Holdings. Called Credit and Commerce American Holdings NV. Credit and Commerce American Holdings. Credit and Commerce American Holdings NV. Credit and Commerce American Holdings stock was owned by various BCCI principals, and it acted as a holding company for Credit and Commerce American Investments BV. Another man involved in Credit and Commerce American Holdings was Mohammed Rahim Motagi Irvani, an Iranian billionaire and the business partner of former CIA Director Richard Helms. Irvani, referred to in the BCCI affair as BCCI's lead frontman in the original takeover of FGB, was directly assisted by Helms in these efforts. As a result, media reports later noted that U.S. Senate investigators are examining dealings between Helms and Irvani that is said raised questions about the CIA's knowledge of BCCI's evolution into a criminal organization. Helms and Irvani also had interlocking business interests with Roy Carlson, the Bank of America executive who had overseen the bank's 1972 purchase of 30% of BCCI shares. In 1975, Carlson left Bank of America to oversee the business interest of Irvani. Years later, Carlson became vice president at Helms consulting firm. Both Carlson and Abedi also had documented ties to BCCI. Carlson had accompanied Abedi on business trips, while Irvani had been recruited into BCCI's affairs directly by Abedi himself. This maze-like structure of offshore companies hid the ultimate controlling body, which of course was BCCI. By forming yet another layer, a dummy company set up beneath Credit and Commerce American Holdings, BCCI was able to evade the prohibition of regulators and finally take control of FGB. Clifford and Altman relayed to regulators that these new purchases were in no way connected to BCCI, and despite the overwhelming abundance of evidence that they were BCCI proxies, the Federal Reserve and other regulators began the approval process. In this sudden about-face, the U.S. government appeared to be simply ignoring the obvious. Good grief. Catherine Austin Fitts, former Assistant Secretary for Housing, Federal Housing Commissioner at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development during the George H.W. Bush administration, and an investment banker with the Hamilton Securities Group in Dillon, Reed and Company, was placed on the board of First American Bank shares, the name of FGB following its takeover by BCCI. Good grief. Following the collapse of BCCI in 1991. She later stated that, after reading through troves of documents regarding the bank's activities prior to its implosion, it was clear that there was no way its clandestine activities were carried on without the full knowledge of the Federal Reserve, specifically the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the White House. Did such knowledge extend back to when BCCI finally gained control of FGB? After the takeover, FGB was rechristened First American Bank Shares, and an impressive plan for growth was launched. Clifford stated that he wanted First American to be one of the 20 biggest banks in the country, and by 1989, it held over $11.5 billion in assets. It also embarked on a close working relationship with its hidden parent company. Dozens of BCCI subsidiaries held accounts at First American branches, and Abedi arranged for BCCI managers to take top positions at the bank. Meanwhile, Abedi courted U.S. politicians and developed a particularly close bond with Jimmy Carter. As BCCI burrowed deeper into the U.S. financial system, Abedi and his close cohorts became involved with the Carter Presidential Center. Abedi, Adnan Khashoggi, and Clifford were all large donors to the center, and BCCI became a mega donor to a third world development project set up by Carter called Global 2000. Abedi was selected to serve as co-chairman of Global 2000, while Carter himself was the acting chairman. Wow. Another politically connected philanthropic outfit that BCCI became connected to was called the Chiefs of Police National Drug Task Force, COP, which received money from First American. The head of COP was Utah Senator Orrin Hatch, who became a defender of BCCI during its collapse and who had ties to a number of its principals. Another figure involved in COP was Randy Anderson, the son of DC journalist Jack Anderson, whose roles in Watergate and the Profumo affair were discussed in previous chapters. First American's board included Robert Keith Gray, who joined shortly after the bank was renamed. 7 years later, in 1988, after Gray had rejoined Hill and Knowlton with his company, Gray & Company becoming a subsidiary of the firm. H&K was retained by BCCI after the bank was indicted in Tampa for drug money laundering. As part of its campaign to distance BCCI's image from illicit activity, H&K disseminated materials discrediting persons and publications whose statements were later proved accurate about BCCI's criminality. As for FGB, First American subsidiary, National Bank of Georgia, it was purchased by BCCI frontman and business partner of Armand Hammer, Gaith Farron. While the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency expressed concern over the purchase, the regulators ultimately allowed these transactions to go through. Roy Carlson, the former Bank of America executive who first forged ties between that bank and BCCI, was recruited by a Betty to run the National Bank of Georgia after it was purchased by Farron. Several years later, Farron resold the bank to none other than First American. Farron, it should be noted, maintained significant political connections of his own. Just prior to his first encounter with Bert Lance, he had bought a large block of stock in the main bank of Houston, Texas. Another Arab investor was the Saudi billionaire Khalid bin Mahfouz, the power behind the prominent National Commercial Bank. Like Farron, bin Mahfouz was extremely close to BCCI and even owned shares in the bank. Later, in 1986, plans were underway for bin Mahfouz to take over both BCCI and Credit and Commerce American Holdings, but internal auditors for National Commercial raised too many questions about the arrangement. Other investors in main bank alongside Farron and bin Mahfouz included John Connolly, the former governor in Texas who was soon to become a major player in the world of defrauding savings and loanings. There was also James R. Bath, a close friend of George W. Bush and, according to his former partner, Bill White, a CIA asset who had been personally recruited by George H.W. Bush in 1976, when Bush was director of the agency. Bath had a long career in aviation, real estate, and finance. Early on, he became a vice president in the Texas division of Atlantic Aviation, which was controlled by the powerful DuPont family. This was followed by Bath Benson Interests, a real estate development company that he co-founded with Lam Benson, the son of future Clinton Treasury Secretary Lloyd Benson Jr. In 1976, the year he was reportedly recruited by G.H.W. Bush and the CIA, he created Jim Bath and Associates. Almost immediately thereafter, Bath's career took a rapid upward ascent. He was named as trustee for Sheikh Salem bin Laden of Saudi Arabia. Bath's job was to handle all of bin Laden's North American investments and operations. He was also made the trustee for bin Mahfouz's U.S. investments. Russ Baker, in Family of Secrets, recounts how Bill White told him that Bath's recruitment by G.H.W. Bush was intimately connected to the growing relationship between Saudi Arabia and Texas Oil. Bath, it seems, was something of a middleman for these two parties, and this presence alongside the two BCCI-linked individuals, Khalid bin Mahfouz and Gaid Farron, should be understood in that context. BCCI's reach extended far beyond Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United States, as it was truly global in scope. The bank maintained, for example, a presence in the People's Republic of China. During the reform and opening up of the PRC under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, BCCI was the second foreign bank to open branches in the country. It secured substantial deposits from the Chinese government and its business affiliates. According to the BCCI affair, Chinese officials and government entities lost around $500 million when the bank collapsed. BCCI also maintained joint ventures with other businesses within China. One of these was the China Arab Bank, a joint venture with the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. At the time, the relationship between the PRC and the Soviet Union was considerably strained, and yet BCCI was in the USSR as well. In an appendix to the BCCI affair titled Matters for Further Investigation, the joint activities for BCCI and the foreign trade mission of the Soviet Union in London was highlighted as significant, but little information was added. The report states that obtaining the records of those financial transactions would be critical to understanding what the Soviet Union under Brezhnev, Chernenko, and Andropov was doing in the West. One clue as to USSR-connected activities was reported by Jonathan Beatty and S.C. Gwynn in their book on BCCI. Beatty was told by a German arms dealer, whom they referred to as Heinrich, that the Soviets were buying Western high technology via BCCI. In this instance, the Navstar GPS system. Throughout the Third World, BCCI presented itself as a development bank. This allowed it to gain intimate access to governments, emerging markets, and the financing systems that they required. It was the second largest of all lenders to the Congo, while in Cameroon, it developed close ties to the country's finance ministry and bribed them to take high interest loans from the bank. Wow. The BCCI affair charges that BCCI cultivated relationships with the United Nations outpost and the U.S. Embassy in Cameroon as well. In Nigeria, meanwhile, BCCI cozied up to the nation's central bank and apparently traveled with their top financial functionaries throughout the world. One witness reported that at a meeting of the World Bank in Seoul, they had observed one of the BCCI officers with a lot of cash handed to the staff of the Central Bank of Nigeria. In Jamaica, BCCI became the intermediary between the state and the world financial system. It handled essentially every foreign current amount of Jamaican government agencies. U.S. government agencies were involved in this corruption of the Jamaican government, as BCCI became involved in financing all of Jamaican's commodity imports from the United States under the U.S. Commodity Credit Corporation. The CCC itself was no stranger to skullduggery. As will be seen, it was implicated, along with BCCI and several connected banks, in the transfer of armaments and munitions to Iraq at the height of the Iran-Iraq War. Through the Gulf Group, headed by Abbas, Mustafa, and Murtata Gokul, BCCI had a foothold in global shipping. Abedi was particularly close to Abbas Gokul, the main figure in Gulf shipping lines. Good grief. He had courted him early on in BCCI's existence, and an ever-escalating series of loans fueled by Gokul's maritime interest, allowing the family to quickly control an impressive fleet. The Gulf Group and BCCI were so fundamentally interwoven, acting as practical extensions of one another, that when BCCI collapsed, the resulting shockwaves profoundly destabilized Gulf. Like Gaith Farron, Abbas Gokul sometimes acted as a frontman or proxy to BCCI. In 1975, for example, he attempted to acquire Chelsea National Bank, a small New York City bank. Regulators very quickly recognized that Gokul had practically no familiarity with the ins and outs of bank ownership, and they saw how closely tied he was to BCCI. In 1976, Gokul admitted that, upon acquiring the bank, he had planned to bring in an BCCI management team to run its operations. In the early 1980s, Gokul approached the intelligence organized crime-linked Bruce Rappaport with an offer to buy 50% of his Intermaritime Bank. Rappaport declined the offer and instead sold 19.9% of the bank's shares to the Gulf Group and added Abbas to his board of directors. Later, when he was shuffled off to prison for his fraudulent activities with BCCI, Abbas's personal secretary went to work for Rappaport. Was Gokul fronting for BCCI and Rappaport's organization? It seems likely, as Rappaport himself maintained numerous ties to the bank. One of his top money managers, the Swiss banker Alfred Hartmann, was himself a BCCI frontman, while Rappaport held a significant stake in the illustrious Bank of New York, which was one of BCCI's correspondent banks. Bert Lance, meanwhile, had mentioned Rappaport in his testimony before the official BCCI inquiry, stating that he believed that Rappaport had been dispatched by William Casey, Rappaport's close friend, to spy on him and keep tabs on BCCI. Lance said that Rappaport maintained contact with him for a period of years until the death of Director William Casey. The BCCI affair states, before adding that Lance failed to mention in his testimony that, despite his suspicions of Rappaport, he arranged with him to have one of his sons work in the financier's New York bank. Both Rappaport and BCCI were also engaged in various activities in the oil-rich nation of Oman. BCCI had been active there since 1973 when, together with Bank of America, it set up the National Bank of Oman. Peter Truell and Larry Gerwin in False Prophets note that the National Bank of Oman became one of BCCI's biggest units with 55 branches. Damn. Tellingly, the BCCI affair suggests that BCCI may have been moving money through the National Bank of Oman to fund the war in Afghanistan, before noting that the National Bank of Oman and the CEO, Qais al-Zawani, also did business with CIA Director Casey's associate, Bruce Rappaport. Interestingly, one of the most active players in Oman's oil market was John Deuce, the enigmatic oil trader whom Ted Shackley had gone to work for after leaving the CIA. In fact, Deuce reportedly hired Shackley specifically to help him operate in Oman. According to one of Deuce's associates, journalist Susan Mazur, Deuce's main contact in Oman was Qais al-Zawani Zawawi of the National Bank of Oman. Could there have been a connection with the purported use of the bank by the CIA to finance the Afghan Mujahideen? It is certainly possible. As mentioned in the last chapter, there are rumors that Itzko, the freight forwarder managed by Shackley's crony Thomas Clines, was involved in the movement of arms and other war supplies to the Mujahideen. Yeah. Yet another player in Oman during this period was a firm called Tetra Tech International. Once a subsidiary of Honeywell, Tetra Tech was run by former CIA officer James Critchfield, who was not only an old Middle East hand, but also a close associate of Shackley. In 1979, Tetra Tech was given supervisory control over the operations of 11 government ministries, major construction projects, the management of ports, the telecommunication infrastructure, the post office, and food inspections were just a handful of things that Tetra Tech controlled in Oman. In addition, as noted in the last chapter, Donald Jameson, a CIA veteran who went to work for Tetra Tech, had been one of the attendees of the Le Circle meeting tied to the October surprise plot. As the BCCI affair makes clear, investigators also suspected a potential connection between Tetra Tech International and the similarly named Tetra Finance, a Hong Kong-based financial outfit that was closely integrated with the Hong Kong Deposit and Guarantee Company. Playing an active role in each of these institutions was John Shaheen, one of William Casey's Hardy Boys, and a central figure in the October surprise plot. Shaheen was paid by each bank to broker deposits and to court wealthy Arabs to join their boards. Individuals who maintained a post on the board of each included Hassan Yassin, Kamal Adam's successor as Saudi intelligence chief and a cousin of Adnan Khashoggi. Another was al-Mazrui, the head of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and director at BCCI. Once again, BCCI appears, albeit surrounded by a heavy fog, in the background of the covert conflicts of the 1980s. The support for the Mujahideen was just one of many instances. Another is the Iran-Contra affair, a global web of operations and cooperating and competing factions, each with logistical networks dedicated to arms dealing, drug smuggling, and money laundering. The complexity of Iran-Contra is simply mind-boggling. Despite its involution at nearly every level of these interlocking components in the operations, one invariably finds the tendrils of BCCI. Oh yeah, I think that's about everybody's favorite affair, the Iran-Contra affair. And with that, I'm going to stop right there for today. Because again, this is another almost 100-page chapter. A killer enterprise. So with that, I'm going to stop right there, bookmark it, and call it a day. Call it a reading. It's only getting juicier. Until next time, everybody, stay up on real history. And with that, stay cool and have a great rest of your day. Paul Greene-Dennis out.